Welcome to this explainer. I was recently digging into the origins of democracy and I stumbled upon this absolutely fascinating paradox. Today we're going to explore the story of Pericles. This is the man who literally birthed a golden age of culture in Athens. But at the exact same time, he laid the groundwork for a completely devastating, catastrophic war. It really makes you wonder just how fragile democracy actually is, right? Because his legacy remains one of the most complex in all of human history. So this leaves us staring at a pretty tough question. How in the world did the father of democracy build such a ruthless empire? I mean, on one hand, he championed this lofty, beautiful ideal where power was supposedly resting in the hands of the many. Yet abroad, he was out there crushing his allies and engaging in some incredibly unforgiving imperial actions. We are going to find out exactly how these two absolute extremes managed to exist in the exact same person. Here is the roadmap we'll be following today. 1. The Radicals' rise. 2. The Athenian Empire. 3. An ancient Cold War. And finally, 4. The fatal strategy. Let's dive right into part 1, the Radicals' rise, from ashes to power. Okay, so picture this. Pericles was born in 495 BC into the Alcmaeonidae family, a deeply influential, highly privileged noble bloodline. But his true defining moment happened when he was just a teenager. In 480 BC, the Persians invaded, and young Pericles was among the tens of thousands who had to run for their lives as Athens was literally burned to the ground. That intense trauma, it shaped his entire generation. When the citizens eventually reclaimed and rebuilt their city, it left a massive power vacuum, along with a burning, desperate desire for security. So over the following decades, Pericles expertly maneuvered himself into absolute power. This all culminated in 461 BC when he successfully orchestrated the exile, or ostracism, of his main conservative rival, a guy named Cimon. And just like that, with Cimon out of the picture, Pericles became the undisputed first citizen of Athens. The guy was an incredibly shrewd political operator. First, he consolidated power by systematically reducing the influence of those old, entrenched noble assemblies, basically giving a much louder voice to the everyday populace. He also knew exactly how to play to the crowd. He funded massive cultural touchstones to stoke patriotic pride, like backing the playwright Aeschylus's famous play The Persians in 472 BC. But, well, here's where it gets a little dark. He also systematically crushed his opposition. How? By literally shipping hundreds of dissenting citizens off to remote garrisons and colonies out in the Aegean and the Black Sea. It was basically a mass ostracism cleverly disguised as colonial expansion, neatly removing absolutely anyone who might dare challenge his authority. Moving right along to part 2, the Athenian Empire, the golden age of coercion. Before we get into the empire itself, we actually need to talk about something called the Delian League. Formed in 478 BC, right after that Persian destruction we just talked about, this was originally a completely voluntary coalition. We're talking hundreds of independent Greek city-states banding together with one shared goal: pool their resources, build a massive share of naval fleet, and protect the Aegean Sea from a third Persian invasion. And honestly, at the time, it made perfect sense as a mutual defense pact. But let's look at the stark contrast of what happened next. Over time, Pericles essentially hijacked this voluntary alliance. What started as a group of independent allies providing their own ships slowly mutated into a system of trapped vassal states paying forced financial tribute directly to Athens. He even took the League's treasury, which was safely kept on the neutral island of Delos, and moved it right into the newly built Parthenon in Athens. Think about that for a second. Pericles was literally taking the defense budget of the entire Greek world to bankroll the spectacular Golden Age architecture of his own city. It was operating a whole lot like a mob protection rocket. And just in case anyone thought membership in this new empire was still optional, we only have to look at the year 440 BC. The wealthy island of Samos tried to assert its independence, which sparked the Samian War. Pericles didn't even try to negotiate. He personally took charge of a massive fleet, ruthlessly suppressed the island, and actually forced Samos to physically tear down their own defensive walls and surrender their remaining ships. It was a brutal, unmistakable message to the rest of the Aegean. Athens, the so-called beacon of democracy, is now your absolute master, and there's no way you're leaving. Which brings us to part 3, an ancient Cold War, Athens versus Sparta. What we have here is a classic, unavoidable ideological clash between two completely incompatible superpowers. On one hand, you have Athens, a democratic, bustling commercial hub and the undisputed supreme naval power dominating the seas. On the other hand, you have Sparta, this highly militaristic, oligarchic society ruled by two kings, and they are the supreme land power dominating the Peloponnese. Their spheres of influence were absolutely bound to collide, as Athens kept growing more powerful, and Sparta grew increasingly terrified of that exact power. Much like the modern Cold War between the US and the USSR, these ancient superpowers didn't just jump into a direct fight. They fought through proxy conflicts for years. All across the Greek world, smaller cities were violently splitting into pro-Athenian and pro-Spartan factions. A major proxy war blew up over the island of Corcyra, modern-day Corfu, which dragged both major alliances right into the mud. Then, Pericles slapped incredibly harsh economic sanctions on the neighboring city-state of Megara, totally strangling their trade. Eventually, all this tension just became unsustainable. The Cold War boiled over, and the devastating Peloponnesian War officially broke out in 431 BC. And that leads us into our final act, Part 4, the fatal strategy. Tragedy strikes Athens. Now, what's really fascinating about Pericles' game plan here is just how incredibly conservative it was. He knew there was no way the Athenian army could beat the highly trained Spartans out on an open battlefield. So he came up with a strategy that was as radical as it was logical: abandon the countryside entirely. He ordered the entire population of the Attic region to pack up and retreat behind the massive long walls that connected Athens to its port. He essentially turned Athens into an untouchable island fortress. Because they controlled the sea, they could supply the city endlessly through the fortified port of Piraeus, and then just use their supreme naval fleet to launch targeted, exhausting strikes against Spartan allies until Sparta finally got tired and gave up. At the end of the first year of the war, the strategy seemed to be working flawlessly. Pericles delivered his famous funeral oration to honor the early dead, and wow, it was a soaring, beautiful piece of rhetoric. He proclaimed that Athens was the school of Hellas, the shining ultimate example for all of Greece. This speech was so incredibly powerful in its articulation of democratic ideals and citizen sacrifice that it actually directly inspired Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address over 2 millennia later. This was Pericles at his absolute, undeniable peak, virtually defining Western democratic thought. But then the ultimate tragic irony strikes. In 430 BC, utter disaster hit the city. The very strategy that Pericles designed to save his people literally became their death trap. Yes, the long walls protected them from Spartan swords, but they also created an intensely overcrowded, wildly unsanitary city. You had tens of thousands of rural farmers packed tightly together. And since Athens relied entirely on its port to bring in food from across the empire, those same life-saving trade routes brought in a deadly plague, most likely arriving from North Africa. Once it breached the walls, the disease ripped through that trapped, concentrated population with terrifying speed. 20%. Just pause and think about that number for a second. That staggering figure represents the portion of the Athenian population wiped out by this horrific disease. To put that into perspective, we're talking about up to 100,000 people dying agonizing deaths. The psychological and physical blow to the city was completely unimaginable. And then, in 429 BC, the plague claimed Pericles himself along with several of his children. In a single instant, Athens lost its guiding hand right at the absolute beginning of its greatest existential crisis. So with his sudden death, the unified vision of Athens basically vanishes overnight. New politicians, demagogues, rose to power, most notably his own incredibly ambitious nephew, Alcibiades. They completely abandoned Pericles' cautious, defensive master plan. Instead, they opted for reckless, aggressive expansion. This whole shift culminated in 415 BC with a disastrous Sicilian expedition, a massive, totally unnecessary overreach to conquer Syracuse that resulted in the complete destruction of the Athenian fleet and thousands of soldiers. Broken, bankrupt, and entirely exhausted, the once glorious Athenian Empire finally threw in the towel and surrendered to Sparta in 404 BC. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this one thought to chew on. Did Pericles' reckless successors ruin his golden city? Or did Pericles guarantee this catastrophic end the exact moment he decided to turn a voluntary alliance into a captive empire? It's a pretty stark reminder that even the greatest democracies can be undone by their own imperial ambitions. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.